I come to the floor today again to talk about the drug epidemic that continues to be such a big issue in my home state of Ohio and around our country. I'm here now for my 56th floor speech, I'm told, on this topic, sometimes talking about the opioid crisis, which has gripped my state like it has so many others in this chamber, but also to talk about other issues that relate to the drug epidemic. It's not just about the prescription drugs, the heroin, the fentanyl, and the carfentanil that have negatively impacted so many men, women, and families, children, devastated so many communities. There are also other issues, and one I want to talk about today is what is happening with regard to crystal meth. Methamphetamines are back with a vengeance, and we need to have a more effective response to it. Congress has actually done quite a bit in the last several years to push back against this drug epidemic. New policies have been in place now at the federal level for the past few years that are promoting better prevention, treatment, recovery, helping our law enforcement be able to respond with Narcan, that miracle drug that reverses the effects of overdoses, helping to ensure that we have a prevention message out there that's more effective. Among other things, Congress has now spent more than $3 billion in additional funding, taxpayer dollars, to support treatment and recovery programs. And it's been needed. The Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act has provided a lot of that, but so has the 21st Century Cures Act that goes directly to the states. And the good news is that these efforts are actually starting to pay off. Drug overdose deaths are still way too high. And in Ohio, we started at a really high water mark. But after 8 years of more people dying every single year, finally, last year, we are seeing in Ohio and around the country a reduction of overdose deaths. That's great news. We peaked in 2017 at 72,000 Americans losing their life. The number one cause of death in my home state of Ohio, and the number one cause of death for all Americans under the age of 50. The progress has been particularly encouraging in places like Ohio. We saw a 21.4% drop in overdose deaths in the first half of last year, 2018. It's the last numbers that we have, the most recent data that we have. This was the biggest drop in the nation, actually, between July of 2018 and July of 2017 and June of 2018. So for that one-year period, according to the CDC's National Center for Health Statistics, Ohio had the biggest drop in the country. Now, again, that's partly because Ohio's numbers were so high. We were second in the nation in overdose deaths in most data. Nationally, we're also seeing a promising, if more modest, downturn in overdose deaths. Between September 2017 and March 2018, again, the most recent data we have, overdose deaths fell from about 72,000 to about 71,000 deaths. Overall, the overdose rate dropped in 21 states, and nearly a full percentage point nationally. So at least we're seeing some progress, finally, after 8 years of increases every year and more heartbreak. This is progress. I think we would have been doing even better, frankly, if we hadn't seen the big influx of fentanyl over the last 3 or 4 years. Again, Congress has passed some important legislation, but we are pushing up against more and more fentanyl coming into our communities. This is this incredibly powerful synthetic opioid, 50 times more powerful than heroin, inexpensive, coming, by the way, primarily from China and primarily through the United States mail system. Our pushback on that more recently that's starting to be effective is called the STOP Act. We just passed it here in this body last year. And what the STOP Act says is the post office has to start screening these packages, particularly from countries like China, where we know this fentanyl is coming in. They haven't done exactly what we've asked them to do yet, but they are doing a better job of stopping this poison coming in from China, where the vast majority comes from. But today, even as we see some progress on opioids, and as we see somewhat less fentanyl coming in, and therefore higher prices of fentanyl on the street, which is important, as we see this progress, we're also seeing something that's very discouraging. And that is what I've been hearing now for over a year from law enforcement, from treatment providers, from social service providers, from community leaders back home, and that is a resurgence of methamphetamines. Pure, powerful crystal meth coming primarily from Mexico. I meet regularly with treatment providers and drug abuse task forces all over our state. Recently, I talked to community leaders in Knox County, in Columbus, at the Southeast Health Services Center, at the Adams Board in Adams, Lawrence, and Sauter counties, Hamilton County, their heroin coalition, and to law enforcement and leadership in the community in Butler County. Every single meeting ended up the same way, which is people saying, we're finally making progress on opioids. Thanks for the help there, because all these communities, all of them, are taking advantage of the legislation we've passed here. But the new scourge is crystal meth. Help us with that. And often, by the way, they're saying this crystal meth is being laced with something else, sometimes fentanyl. So this same deadly fentanyl we talked about earlier is sometimes now being laced with crystal meth, making for a devastating cocktail. October 2018 report from Ohio University said that psychostimulants, including methamphetamines, they're called psychostimulants, were found in just 9 unintentional deaths in 2010. That number rose to 509 in 2017, the most recent data we have. That's over a 5,000% increase. So something's happening out there. Again, finally getting control of the opioid issue, even the fentanyl synthetic opioids, which is the latest surge, and now we're seeing methamphetamine deaths rising dramatically. According to the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, deaths involving cocaine and psychostimulants, again including meth, have also increased nationwide in recent years. Among the more than 70,000 drug overdose deaths in 2017, more than 23,000, nearly a third, involved psychostimulants like meth, cocaine, or both. From 2016 to 2017, death rates involving cocaine and psychostimulants like meth each increased by approximately 33%. And increases increased across all demographic groups, all census regions, and in several states. In 2018, a report from the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services highlights the intertwined nature of the rising meth usage and the ongoing opioid crisis. They said some meth users initially turned to this drug, to methamphetamines, to manage the heavy crashes that followed prolonged use of heroin and other opioids. And then they became just as addicted to meth as they were addicted to opioids. So that's one reason I think you see this increase in methamphetamines in Ohio, is because users are turning to meth to manage the crashes that follow prolonged use of heroin. Meth is now stronger, cheaper than ever before. And again, it's coming almost exclusively to Ohio from Mexico. The days of home chemists and the one-pot meth labs are actually over. You probably remember in your community, or you probably heard about it in other states, where these meth labs were being set up. And they created a huge environmental problem, as well as the issue of producing meth, which was devastating communities. Those meth labs are pretty much gone now. In Ohio, there is not a county that tells me they have a meth lab left. That might sound like good news, but it's actually bad news. The meth labs are gone because the meth coming in from Mexico is more powerful and it's cheaper. So why make meth in the basement when you can have crystal meth delivered to your doorstep from Mexico? It's being mass-produced by Mexican drug cartels who are then smuggling it in to the United States. According to Dennis Lowe, who's the commander of major crimes unit in Athens, Ohio, the Mexican drug cartels almost single-handedly eliminated meth labs in the state of Ohio, he said. People are getting better quality product and it's cheaper to buy from a cartel, end quote. So more powerful, more deadly, and cheaper. By the way, one Columbus, Ohio law enforcement officer recently told me that crystal meth on the streets of Columbus is less expensive than marijuana now. Another reason you see it increasing. As I've heard from folks all over Ohio, we're also seeing meth laced with other drugs, as I said, including fentanyl, heroin, and cocaine. Many of these cartels splice these drugs into methamphetamines but don't tell the customers that, so users may be consuming dangerous opioids without realizing it. Any street drug can be deadly. Much of the methamphetamine, of course, as I said, enters in Mexico through the ports of entry. So it comes in bulk through the ports of entry. It's often hidden in cars, hidden in trucks. Smugglers make it through this screening process, and then they sell it through their distribution networks. So we need to do more at the ports of entry to have better screening. According to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection folks, the amount of methamphetamine seized at our ports of entry has soared from 14,000 pounds in 2012 to 56,000 pounds in 2018. Huge increase. In fact, just in the last year alone, we've seen a 38% increase in methamphetamine trafficking across the southern border. According to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Ohio, the number of crystal meth submissions to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation's lab rose from 2,000 in 2015 to over 12,000 in 2018. Just in a 3-year period, a 500% increase. What's happening with crystal meth is one reason we need more resources to secure our southern border. It's not just my opinion. The experts at the Customs and Border Protection tell us they need more physical barriers, they need more Border Patrol agents, they need more technology, they need more surveillance, they need more cameras, they need more screening to stop this illegal flow of drugs. I think we are beginning now to make some progress there because we're deploying more sophisticated technology at the ports of entry. And that's smart. But the traffickers are smart. And they're also learning ways to avoid those ports of entry, to go around them, cross wherever they can continue this evil and prosperous trade. The story originating in Galion, Ohio last year caught the nation's attention. A 5-year-old had been out trick-or-treating Halloween last year, and he was exposed to meth and began suffering from seizures and other symptoms of meth exposure. Law enforcement checked his Halloween candy thinking that was the problem, and it was not. It wasn't laced with the drug as they feared, but then they found the meth. It was at his own home, his own family home. His father eventually was charged with possession of the drugs and tampering with evidence. But here's a 5-year-old kid suffering from a meth exposure. 2 weeks ago, I was in Knox County, Ohio, central Ohio, where I participated in a roundtable discussion with local elected leaders and law enforcement officials, mental health recovery folks. This board is focused on the crystal meth problem. Why? Because it's overwhelming them. Opioids used to be their #1 issue. Now it's crystal meth. I was told that methamphetamines are now involved in 89% of the drug cases in Knox County. And in many cases, there's polysubstance abuse or overlap between a combination of meth, heroin, and marijuana. Last August, the Knox County Sheriff's Department arrested 3 individuals who were involved in trafficking, distribution of meth, moving from Columbus into Knox County. And by the way, what law enforcement tells me about methamphetamines is that it's causing a new spate of crimes, somewhat closer to the cocaine crimes that were being committed back in the 1990s when cocaine was the primary concern. Heroin is a drug that does not create the same stimulant effect. It's not a psychostimulant. So the crimes primarily are crimes to pay for the drug, property crimes, whereas the meth crimes tend to be often crimes of violence because it is a stimulant like cocaine. So these law enforcement tells me they're very concerned. Their jails are being crowded now with meth users who are there for serious crimes. Their big issue that they're looking at is how do you get people through successful recovery? Here's the other bad news. We don't know much about how to help people in recovery with methamphetamines. We know that with regard to opioids, there are medication-assisted treatments that can be used. And in general, recovery practices that work for opioids can work for meth, taking people through a therapy process, but there is not the drugs to be able to help you through it as there is with opioids. So it's an even tougher problem in some respects. We talked about the federal funding that had been awarded to Knox County when I was there, and they're really happy about it. They're getting money through the 21st Century Cures funding that came from here. It went to the state of Ohio and went down to them. They're getting money from my CARA legislation, the Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act. They're also getting funding from the Drug-Free Communities Act, a legislation that I authored when I was in the House of Representatives many years ago and is being used for prevention very effectively in some of these counties. But one thing they said about the funding was that they want to be sure that there is more flexibility, particularly in the 21st Century Cures funding. So it can be used not just for opioids, but also for dealing with this meth issue, which is their big problem now. So my hope is that we'll begin to see some flexibility in those funding streams to be able to help places like Knox County. We need to build a sustainable infrastructure for prevention, treatment, and longer-term recovery from all drugs. These communities having that flexibility gives them the ability to respond to whatever the latest problem is facing their community. The U.S. Attorney's Office based in Cleveland, Ohio, which is led by Justin Herdman, has been deeply involved in this effort to combat the spread and distribution of meth. Last August, his office indicted 8 people in federal court for their efforts to create a methamphetamine and cocaine trafficking supply network, a supply chain from Mexico all the way to Ohio. In connection, DEA agents seized more than 144 pounds of meth from a warehouse outside of Cleveland. It's believed to be the largest seizure of methamphetamine in Ohio history. And again, it demonstrates just how serious this threat is and how these criminal organizations pose such a threat to our state and our country. Back in 2005, Congress passed a bill on meth. It was called Combat Methamphetamine Epidemic Act, and it regulated the over-the-counter sale of certain drugs, like epinephrine, because of their use in the manufacture of methamphetamines. This helped to combat the ability of domestic producers to manufacture cheap methamphetamine from over-the-counter medicines that were easy to get. It dropped the price and reduced its availability. However, Mexican cartels have now again supplanted these domestic labs. So that legislation is no longer effective because here we are laden with these cheap, high-quality crystal meth supplies from Mexico. As the public learns more about the dangers of opioids and works to wean themselves off those drugs, methamphetamine, if left unchecked, is primed now to become the new drug of choice, perpetuating the cycle of abuse. We can't let that happen. As we begin to make progress again on the opioid epidemic, which was the worst drug crisis in the history of our country, and remains so, we can't take our eye off the ball. What we're doing is actually helping on the fight against opioids. We need to keep it up. We're actually making progress, finally. We've got to keep the pressure on. But my question is, what do we do about the next wave coming? What do we do about the methamphetamine that's coming into my state and your state? First, we need to continue awareness about the issue of addiction generally. This is not about one drug, or just opioids, or just meth, or just cocaine. It's about the overall issue of addiction, treating addiction like a disease, which it is, providing better treatment so that people can get back on their feet, providing longer-term recovery. So raising that awareness generally is important, not just as to opioids, but as to addiction, which is really the issue. Second, we got to do more at our southwest border to stop the flow of this crystal meth coming in. It's not the ultimate solution because there's enough demand here in America for this drug. It'll find its way in. But we can stop some of it. We're beginning to do that. And at a minimum, we can raise the price on the street, which is one of the problems right now. As I said, incredibly inexpensive. As one law enforcement person told me, less expensive than marijuana in some cities of America. Third, we need to do more to support federal prevention programs that can address this issue. Prevention, education, awareness, this is ultimately the most effective way to stop this epidemic from growing. One tool to do that is called the Drug-Free Communities Act, and it's established more than 2,000 coalitions now around the country. Let's continue to support those coalitions. Very little federal money has gone in compared to the private sector money, the state and local money, the foundation money, but it leverages some of that other money. We need to continue to support these community foundations. Second, let's start a new prevention program focused on this meth challenge. One place we could find that funding, by the way, is in the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act. We authorized and then actually appropriated $10 million for a national prevention program. Allowed HHS to set that up. They haven't done it yet. I think it's important we do it. And I would take that $10 million and multiply it many-fold by using it as leverage to go out to the private sector, to encourage foundations, companies, pharma companies, and others to help in this effort. I believe that there's an interest in that. I know there is. Let's do a massive prevention program because that may be, in the end, the most effective way to keep people from getting into the funnel of addiction in the first place. Fourth, we need to continue to expand and support these high-intensity drug trafficking areas. They really work. I will tell you, in Ohio, when you have federal resources combined with state and local resources, and they're better coordinated together, focused on this drug issue, they make a lot of sense. They've stopped a lot of the meth distribution, as I said, in Ohio. I talked about what happened in Northeast Ohio recently with the largest meth seizure ever. That was through the HIDA program. Fifth, we need a more effective treatment for meth. NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and the NIH, National Institute of Health, are working on answers. But we need new medications so we can assist with quality treatment to help those suffering from addiction get into recovery. Now, this is a major challenge. I spoke to Scott Gottlieb today, who's a former FDA commissioner, about this issue, and I've talked to others. We need to do everything we can here to support efforts to try to come up with medication that can assist with regard to the treatment for these psychostimulant drugs. Finally, we've got to be sure that communities have more flexibility to use the federal funding they're already getting through cures, through these state opioid response grants to address issues like meth. I'm exploring whether legislation is necessary to provide that flexibility, but I believe a lot of it could be provided through the administration of these grants and through the states. I'll continue to ensure that the federal government is a better partner for those working on the front lines on this drug epidemic. Opioids, yes, we need to keep up the fight. We're finally making progress. After 8 years of increases in opioid deaths, finally, last year, for the first time in 8 years, we're seeing a reduction of those deaths, the worst drug epidemic in the history of our country. It's not a time for us to pull back. It's a time to focus on what's working and do more of it. But also, we have these new challenges, particularly crystal meth, and we need to do a better job of addressing that, as we've talked about today. Working together, I believe we can make a difference. I believe we can turn the tide on addiction in this country. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.